Hey there, everyone. So one of the most commonly engaged in philosophical questions is the essence of morality. Is it objective? In other words, is it this absolute, timeless, permanently binding thing? Or is it subjective or relative, which is to say subject to or relative to some historical period or group of people or moral outlook, etc.? And maybe you're like me and you started learning about this question through the philosophy of religion. For me, as I was becoming an atheist, I was running into all kinds of arguments and concerns about, what is the essence of morality without God? Morality is bankrupt without God. And I think this showcases pretty well the fact that people on both sides of this camp typically aren't able to understand the plausibility of an ethical framework that isn't their own. People who believe in an objective morality find subjective morality absolutely baseless and pointless, and people with subjective moral frameworks find objective morality equally baseless or meaningless or, whatever it may be. So my hope here is to explain both of these positions, explain some of the philosophical positions that would constitute these positions, at least in brief, so that you can understand kind of the essence of these two positions. Now, first off, we have objective morality. And once again, someone who believes that morality is objective is going to say that a moral claim or an ethical claim that you ought to do something or you ought not to do something, because that's what a moral claim is an ought statement, that those are eternally binding, they are absolute, and they are unquestionably true. They have a truth value. So a moral objectivist is not going to say, like the name, maybe you're thinking that moral objectivists think morality is a tangible corporeal object, like it's some sort of substance. And I don't really believe that. I don't know of any positions that hold goodness to be some sort of substance. Maybe you could consider Christianity insofar as God is love, and some Christians interpret that as meaning that God's very essence is love, that when you love someone, that is like God's pure qualities being exchanged or something, and that as such, the substance of God is the substance of love. Maybe you could argue that, but long way around to get to, I don't know that there are many people who are moral objectivists who would say that it is some sort of object in that sense, that it's some sort of substance. But what it does mean, for example, is that this book, just like it is an object for me, just like it exists outside of me, irrespective of my thoughts about whether it exists, moral objectivists will typically say that moral claims are independent of the mind, that they are real things, whether we like it or not, and they tell us real facts about the world that don't depend on the people who those facts are subject to. So, say there's some sort of murder trial going on. A moral objectivist would say, well, murder is absolutely wrong, always has been, always will be. We can know that for certain. And it doesn't depend on us just saying it does. It is some sort of standard outside of humans that is applied to them. Now, a common instance of moral objectivism would be divine command theory. And divine command theory is a fairly common theological perspective on ethics, which says that whatever the divine commands, whatever is spoken by God or instantiated by God, is good by default. And, technically we could consider this an appeal to authority. I could have a Trump command theory, and everything that Trump says is good. And you kind of see that it's a little bit of a just appealing to some authority, and you could say that this is the best authority. I mean, someone could say that about Trump or something. I don't know. Just some food for thought. But the divine command theory is a common position where morality is objective because it comes from a place outside of humans, outside of the limitations of the human mind, namely the divine, and the divine gives these moral edicts to humans to follow in, for example, the Ten Commandments. Now, of course, there are other ethical systems other than divine command theory. Even within theistic frameworks, there are other ethical systems aside from divine command theory, and maybe like some sort of virtue ethics, where one ought to do those things which, for example, for Aristotle, promote good habits and good character. And these are the virtues. So chastity, duty, bravery, these kind of things that, like for Aristotle, morality in politics' job is to build citizens of good character and create this equanimitous society. So it's our job to do the things that make us a better person by upholding virtues. And virtue ethics is a common ethical framework in the New Testament of the Bible, for example. And a virtue ethicist will do a number of different things to figure out how exactly do I figure out what is virtuous. And I've done a lecture on a lot of the ethical systems that I'm going to be talking about here that you can find if you want more specific details here, because this will just be a brush over in terms of what an ethics class would cover. But a virtue ethicist would, at least if they're an objective virtue ethicist, would say, okay, there are things that are objectively virtuous for humans to do, and that as such, it is binding that one must do them. A common example is Immanuel Kant's virtue ethics, in which lying is always wrong. And Kant says that we can know that lying is always wrong because it is a categorical imperative, which is to say, irrespective of our subjective opinions or our ends that we're trying to reach, this is not treating morality as a means to an end, but it's doing something because it is good in and of itself, irrespective of what ends it applies to. So in this case, Kant basically just says lying is always wrong. And there's a common little little story that Kant has where someone comes up to you. You've got someone who's hiding in your house and they're innocent and someone is trying to kill them. And the murderer comes to your door and they knock and they say, is this person inside your house? Now, Kant says you can't lie, but you can tell the truth in such a way where maybe they slipped out 5 minutes ago, but you saw them last time they were in place. So you say, yeah, last time I saw them, they were here. This is true. Last time you saw them, they were in fact there, but since you have gone away, they have run away, and thus you didn't lie. So, Kant would say that we can just follow this categorical imperative all the time and we'll be good. So that's another little taste of, virtue ethics, of doing the right thing because it is virtuous, it builds good character. Another example of this within virtue ethics might be the kind of clothing you wear. Modesty is a virtue, at least in most virtue ethics systems. This is one of the things, is virtue ethics systems disagree about what is considered virtuous. And this isn't necessarily a hit on them. I mean, most ethical systems are not solved. Even ones that claim to be objective, there's lots of disagreement within, which is just, that's how the human mind works when we're trying to figure stuff out. But modesty would be a good example of a virtue, because maybe you could look at someone who has gone to like a rave or a dance or some kind of party or something, and it's a woman and she's very scantily clothed. And you could say, well, oh, she shouldn't do that with her body. That's not virtuous for her to do with her body. That's not doing what her body was created for or meant for. Created for obviously implies some sort of creator who dictates what is virtuous. So we can see a little bit of the divine command theory slipping in here in terms of what it means to be virtuous. But another one could say, well, that's not what you're supposed to do with your body, because if everybody did that, society would be chaos. If everyone showed their body like you would, we'd all just be going crazy with sex and stuff like that. That's kind of a Kantian argument of, irrespective of our ends, we know we can't do that action, because if everybody did it, society would be crazy. We couldn't function if everybody did it. There are a number of issues with Kant's system that I discuss in my lecture on duty-based ethics, of which virtue ethics would be a subset of that system. But that's a common moral position that we see today, that there are certain ways of dressing that are not virtuous. They are not what your body was meant for or created for, or how we treat it in society. Now, all of this contrasts with moral subjectivism or moral relativism. And a good way to understand this system is to look at, for example, slavery laws. Now, many people today, it is just intuitively obvious that slavery is wrong. It's reprehensible to most modern minds. But, as far-fetched as it may sound, slavery was once not only legal, but much more societally accepted than it is today. And a moral objectivist could say, well, yeah, it's just taken us a while to figure out what these objective systems are. But the moral subjectivist looks at morality and says, well, why should we assume that the moral standpoint we've gotten to today is the one that is objectively binding, and everything that was before us is just preliminary? And that seems a little bit narcissistic, because the people who thought slavery was okay felt the same way as the objectivist does now about the fact that we don't think slavery is okay. And this does not mean that ethical claims don't mean anything. For a moral subjectivist, and there are lots of varieties of this. You can have a moral nihilist, which is kind of the most extreme version of this. And then you can kind of have someone who would consider themselves a moral relativist or subjectivist and not be maybe as extreme as the moral nihilist. A good example of moral nihilism is the Marquis de Sade, who I've done a few lectures on here if you want to check that out. But a moral subjectivist doesn't say that moral claims have no meaning or that they don't exist. But what they are going to say is that a moral claim is relative to some sort of factor. In this case, maybe it is relative to the society that you live in and the time period in that society. Because we see moral feelings change all the time. I mean, going back to modesty, the culture surrounding what it means to dress modestly has changed a lot. Even if you look within like Christian subcultures, for example, of what it means to be modest, a lot of the ways that certain ladies dress, maybe older generations might have been like, no, that is just objectively immodest, even though the ladies dressing like that today would be like, no, I'm a Bible-thumping Christian and I believe that the Bible says that I can dress such and such a way. So we do see morality changing, at least, and even the objectivist, like I said, could accede to this claim that, okay, yeah, at least from the perspective of what we think is moral, it has changed over time. Now the moral objectivist is going to say, well, this moral edict of what we ought to follow has always been there. It's just taken us a while to find. But the moral subjectivist is going to say, well, that in fact, moral systems are predicated upon presuppositions which are not timeless, which depend and are relative on some sort of framework. Take, for example, murder. This is a common objection that we see in, for example, theist versus atheist debates. And the atheist says, something about morality not being objective, that it is kind of amenable to the times and it's something that we construct. And the theist will say, are you going to say that the Holocaust wasn't objectively wrong? And you get in that bind and it's like, oh, shiver me timbers. I can't say that the Holocaust was objectively wrong. I have to say that it was subjectively wrong. But it's crucial that that does not mean that it wasn't wrong at all. One can still look at that historical situation, still look at the ethical standards of the time, and say that it was objectively wrong from that subjective perspective that the Holocaust was wrong. And a good way to understand this would just be to look at murder in general, not even in the Holocaust, but just murder in general. The objectivist is going to say, murder is wrong all the time. But immediately we can see that, for example, de jure, so in law or by law, morality is not really treated as objective. Because even the act of killing someone can be considered vehicular manslaughter. It can be considered attempt to murder. It can be considered some sort of coercive situation. It can be considered self-defense. And self-defense is probably the most damning thing, because in both cases, you are murdering a person. You are killing a person without their consent. But of course, in one case, if they were the aggressor first, then self-defense comes into place, and murder is not wrong. In other words, our moral judgment is subject to or relative to particular statements about the particular situation. But if they weren't the aggressor and you just kill someone, well then, it's obviously murder, and they get a harsher sentence, they get maybe even like a death penalty or something like that. But we can see, even within the supposedly innocent notion of murder being wrong, we have to be more clear about, what do you mean by murder? What do you mean by wrong? We have to go into the situation and look at the objective claims relative to a situation, which is to say that ultimately, even from this sort of naive perspective of, killing is always wrong or murdering is always wrong, obviously that's not the case de jure. Even in a lot of these systems that are objective, or at least claim to be, such as the Bible, for example, God wiped out the entire earth and all living things in a flood. So, clearly there are situations where killing things is permissible. So oftentimes these objective claims can be poked up a little bit, and we can poke holes in them. And, when the theist says to the atheist, for example, in some sort of debate in front of this huge audience, are you going to say that the Holocaust wasn't objectively wrong? Or that murder isn't objectively wrong? Let's just take it to that. Well, I can say, why do we think murder is wrong? And the theist might say, well, it is objectively bad for us. It will kill us. That's the end of us. And the subjectivist can say, well, why is it bad that we die? Why is it objectively the case that human well-being is the barometer for our ethical judgments? And the theist is just going to have to say, well, I'm human, and I care about human well-being because it helps me out. Because it feels good to create a system that's built around my well-being, built around the presupposition that human well-being is the barometer for ethical judgments. Because, for example, there are a lot of vegan activists today who say the idea of humans being the only barometer for ethical judgments leaves out other forms of life that suffer that aren't accounted for in an ethical system because we just presuppose them unworthy of consideration. And you could say, well, it just doesn't, the animals don't really concern me. They're not really that important to me. And the to me is really the nail in the coffin. It is subject to the person you ask. It is relative to my presuppositions about what I find worthy of protection or not, of whose well-being I find important. And, the theist might say, well, is it not just objectively bad that you ought not to murder because it is bad for them? Look, it's not objectively bad to do something just because it's bad for some organism, because, for example, unhealthy foods are just objectively bad for your body. I eat unhealthy foods all the fucking time. And there's nothing objective saying that you ought not eat unhealthy foods, for example, or ought not murder, for example. But there are relative claims where you can say, relative to the standard of human well-being, I can objectively say that you ought not eat unhealthy foods, for example. It is objectively the case that if we start from some subjective reference frame, say human well-being, say my well-being, I should not be eating certain foods that I do in fact eat. Just the same way for murder. If we say, from the subjective perspective of valuing human well-being specifically, not any other organisms or species, just humans, from that subjective perspective, it is objectively the case that one ought not murder. So we can see that the subjectivist is going to say that we can make objective claims, but within a subjective system, understanding that there are presuppositions behind our ethical systems which allow us to make statements at all, which can have a truth value, but it depends on our subjective preferences, our presuppositions. For example, rights-based ethics. And in rights-based ethics, moral claims, moral edicts, their validity is based off of whether or not they protect rights or how they apply to rights. So, for example, I could say that it is immoral for me to spy on someone because it violates their right to privacy. Or it is wrong to put duct tape over someone's mouth because it violates their freedom of speech, their right to speech, or their right not to have their speech impeded. And there's kind of a whole debate behind, what are rights, like metaphysically, how do we find them? But there are plenty of systems of law, for example, who fully admit, look, we just care about, say, the French Republic, for example. That the well-being of the citizens in this country is predicated upon you being a member of the French Republic, as was the case for the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So, even in this case of law, there was just a subjective presupposition of, oh, if you're a member of this nation, you're morally worthy, or you have such and such rights. So this is another kind of drop in the bucket for the subjectivist position to say that, look, all the times we care about just certain groups of people, our moral claims aren't actually intended to be objective, because it's the case that moral objectivists will say something is always ethically binding, that, for example, man is endowed with these inalienable rights, and then they won't give those rights to women or to black people on the grounds that they're not human enough or they're not rational enough or, whatever it may be. So all the time these objective claims kind of just sail over certain things, proving in fact that maybe they were never really intended to be objective in the first place. They were intended rather to prop up a certain group of people. So I hope this better explains the difference between these two perspectives, some of the conflicting accounts of what makes something ethical or not. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. Maybe you need help with some reading, maybe you want to talk about ethics, maybe you want to talk about Israel and Palestine, I don't know, whatever you want to tailor it to. That's it. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in another lecture.